I'd like to acknowledge that today's talk is one of the Deitchman family lectures on religion and modernity. The Deitchman lectures explore the place of faith and religion in a world that is sometimes at odds with faith, other times in search of it, and always at work reshaping it. I'm grateful to the support of John Deitchman of the class of 1970 and his family for making it possible. Today I'm really pleased to introduce a distinguished historian and public intellectual, Samuel Moyn, to help us explore the roots of human rights discourse. Samuel Moyn is Henry R. Luce Professor of Jurisprudence at Yale Law School and Professor of History at Yale University. Previously, he held professorships at Harvard and Columbia University. He's written several books in the field of European intellectual history and human rights history, including The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History, in 2010. He's edited and co-edited a number of others. His most recent books are Christian Human Rights, published in 2015, and Not Enough, Human Rights in an Unequal World, which he published last year. He co-founded and serves as editor of the journal Humanity and served as co-editor of Modern Intellectual History. He's written for the Boston Review, the Chronicle of Higher Education, Dissent, The Nation, The New Republic, New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. For more on his writings and related works, I'd encourage you to pick up one of the resource guides that the library put together outside with some of his materials and other related materials. And there's a display of them in Dinant even. In the library, you've got a display. So today he speaks on an intriguing topic, given that we all, I presume, imagine the notions of human rights and human dignity are, as they claim to be, universal secular concepts, not tied to any faith. His talk today is entitled The Christian Invention of Human Dignity. So please join me in welcoming Samuel Moyn.
Hi, thanks for coming. Really nice to be here. So I am going to talk about human rights and where they came from, at least where and when and how we began talking about them. But I'm going to focus on this idea of human dignity. And when you do so, I think you start to see what an important, though maybe complex role that Christians have played in how the idea of human rights came about. Now, we're in an era in which lots of claims are being made on the idea of human dignity, including now in the U.S. Supreme Court. And we can talk about that if you're interested. Former Justice Anthony Kennedy was a big partisan of alluding to human dignity as the source of many of his views, and as a result of lots of interest far beyond the United States in what human dignity might mean in politics and law. Lots of scholars have tried to figure out, well, what is it? And for me, where did it come from? But let's start with a political moment, because as you'll see, it's going to be relevant to where I come out. When Donald Trump was elected to the presidency of this country, the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, wrote him a note and made it public, and it was published in all the newspapers of the world. And she said, "Take care. We're both conservatives, but you're a different kind of conservative than I am. And the difference is that, or the fear I have, is that you're going to be one of the kinds of conservatives who abandons the dignity of man as the basis of your policy." Now, who knows what she meant exactly, but she said it, and that's interesting. And it wasn't the first time. Actually, a year before, she had spoken about why she was so controversially in her country, and especially her party called the Christian Democrats, argued for so many refugees to be allowed in, at least relative to all the other countries of Europe during the Syrian refugee crisis. And what she said is that we're Christian Democrats. That's the name of our party. And our party was founded on the idea of human dignity. Now, we may be conservatives, which the Christian Democrats are in German politics, but there were limits on how one might treat one's fellow human beings on grounds of their human dignity, she said. And you see there that it's her party that she's claiming it is founded on this idea, and she's asking her fellow Christian Democrats to take that fact seriously. Now, all by itself, we may not yet know what these folks mean by human dignity or what we might mean by it. And it's what I want to explore is not just where this idea comes from in Merkel's and our discourse, but also what seems to be meant by it in history. So I'm going to start with what I think of as maybe the most pivotal moment in the public history of claims on human dignity, which came early in World War II, when the Roman Catholic pontiff, Pius XII at that time, gave a Christian Christmas message, so late 1942. And in this message, he says, I want this war on which I'm not taking sides yet, to be settled and to reach a peaceful settlement on the basis of some basic principles. And you'll notice that the first of these principles in these 5 peace points he offered in December 1942 was the dignity of the human person. And you'll note that even more interestingly, he says there are some basic personal rights, even the unforgettable rights of man, that flow from my commitment, our commitment as Christians or Roman Catholics to the dignity of the human person. Now, you may say that all sounds very familiar. You may have heard it in, school. You may have heard it at this university. But actually, I think I haven't found a higher profile invocation of the idea of human dignity in world politics before that date. And so it seems quite important that we reckon with why he said it and what he may have meant by it. It's also quite interesting, I think, that he says from human dignity derives our idea of human rights. Now, if you go back, there was a revolution in this country on the basis of natural rights in 1776, but nobody at the time of the American Revolution mentioned the dignity of man. A few years later in France, there was the most famous revolution on the basis of human rights, the French Revolution, and yet again, when they propounded their Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in 1789, they didn't mention human dignity either. So something new is afoot, I think, at this moment, both in the promotion of the idea of human dignity as politically crucial and in the claim that it's the basis of the human rights we might have. So I want to figure out, where did that come from? What did it mean? So there are lots of proposals about this, and what I want to start out by saying is that everybody else is wrong, because they've been looking too early for the origins of this idea or too late. And that'll, of course, open up, when the right time is to look. So some people say human dignity, okay, the word's not there since it's a Latin word, but it's got to be in the Bible. Obviously, Genesis 1:26-7, which says that man is made in the image and likeness of God, is basically the idea of human dignity. And maybe it's true that on the basis of Genesis 1:26, you can develop the inference that everybody matters or that humanity is important compared maybe to all the other animals or non-human nature. And yet when we look at the interpretation of Genesis 1:26-7 in history, in medieval intellectual history in particular, we find that it's sort of a metaphysical idea for Jews and Christians, but no big political consequences are being drawn from it. And so even if we want to claim that there's some basis for human dignity in biblical sources, we have to figure out why do people start to make political claims on Genesis 1:26-7, which happens, I think, much later. Now, if we track the history of the word human dignity, we have a very different set of sources, since, as I mentioned, it's a Latin word that means rank. And historians have shown that the people who use it most through the 17th century are aristocrats who are saying they rank high relative to other humans. So it's not a claim about the dignity of human beings, it's about the dignity of some human beings, that they have high office or high standing. And sometimes Christians use the word dignity to refer to the high rank of various things like marriage, but not so much in relation to individuals who have high standing on the basis of their humanity as such. Now, if that's true, some historians and philosophers have said, maybe we should look for when, like, everybody becomes an aristocrat. The first people who have high standing and status and dignity are the cream of the crop. And what must happen slowly over time is that more people get aristocratic privilege until magically everyone has it. And that's where human dignity comes from. Now, that could be true, but as we'll see, I don't think it matches the evidence in the time period I'm going to talk about. After all, lots of people are engaging in lots of abhorrent practices all along this timeline, including slavery and patriarchy and genocide, things that we would say are affronts to human dignity. And so maybe we should look at when it was decided that everyone has high standing, rather than thinking it just kind of happened slowly and magically. Now, then there are those who I think say human dignity comes from too late. And they're right to look at documents, crucial documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, as you can see, is committed to the inherent dignity of all members of the human family. And just as important, to the West German Constitution, which is famous for having as its first article that human dignity shall be inviolable. And because of these texts, there's a large group of people who have said, you know what? People must have said that World War II was so terrible, and in particular what happened to the Jews was so outrageous, that we finally needed to stand on principle and say that all humans matter and should have high standing and dignity. I think the trouble there is that it comes a bit too late. It doesn't seem as if we can find lots of evidence that people in general in 1948, and especially West Germans in 1949, knew or cared much about the Holocaust in particular. And above all, we've already seen that it was when the Holocaust had just begun, but he didn't talk about it, that Pius XII invoked human dignity. And so we have to figure out what he meant. And so I want to look in my time at what we now call trans-war history, this mysterious period in between the 1930s and the 1940s, when the possibility of things like the Universal Declaration and the West German Constitution are being set up, but a time we need to look at very closely so we make sure we understand what people meant by terms like human dignity and human rights. Of course, this is also the moment when Angela Merkel's party was founded and when the Cold War was initiated. So we'll have to keep that in mind too by the end of the story. So I'm going to start in a very weird place. 5 years before Pius XII canonized human dignity for world politics, this man, I think, took a major step that we should think of as maybe one of the first moves in making dignity of great political significance, at least in one country, namely Ireland. This is a man named Eamon de Valera, who was in charge of Ireland in 1937. And he's important for the story I want to tell because he chose to write a constitution then, the new Constitution of Ireland. He didn't like the old one because it was too liberal. And he wanted to replace it with a conservative constitution that was more open to the fact that Ireland was a Roman Catholic country. Now, he also hated the fact that the old constitution required a loyalty oath to the British Empire, and he was, among many other things, an Irish nationalist who wanted complete independence for Ireland. And yet, what I want to focus on is like the moment in the history of Christianity, very confusing moment in which he's writing. In 1937, we're 8 years into the era that the Great Depression kicked off. People think that liberal democracy has failed or is failing and needs to be replaced. So it's not just that de Valera wants to write a more conservative constitution, but it seems as if people everywhere, including Christians and Roman Catholics among them, believe they have to replace liberal democracy altogether. That's what's happening, obviously, in places like Italy and Germany, which has moved to National Socialism in 1933. But there are some Christians, including Roman Catholics, who have more power in certain places to create right-wing Christian regimes. The best examples of those, I think, right before de Valera has a chance to write his constitution in 1937, are Portugal and Austria, both of whom move to the right in coups and create regimes that are supposed to be in tune with Roman Catholic social thought. We can say the same thing happens in Spain shortly after, when a strong man named Francisco Franco wins a civil war and tries also to bring his country into line with Roman Catholic social thought as he understands it. Now, this is the atmosphere in which de Valera's writing his constitution. He's also in a Roman Catholic country, which, like Austria and Portugal and Spain soon, seem like they're giving up on liberal democracy altogether in the name of Roman Catholicism. And the same was going to happen during World War II in places like France and in Slovakia. This, there's some connection here to the nationalism he supports. And yet, he doesn't want, for lots of reasons, sincere belief, geopolitics, coalition building, to give up on liberal democracy altogether. He wants to think about something new, a new kind of religious nationalism that let's say, inhabits liberal democracy and changes it, and creates a kind of liberal democracy that's different, hasn't existed before. It's more compatible with conservative morality, without giving up on parliament and voting and such. And so it's in this atmosphere that he writes what I think is as the first example of what you might call religious constitutionalism. It takes a tool of the liberals, a constitution with rights listed for the citizens, and it explores how far can it be pushed in the direction of religious conservatism. So it's like a third way project in between liberalism and religious authoritarianism. Now, in the constitutional text, we'd have to look there to see exactly what this means for the citizens of Ireland. He tries to strip women of the vote, which they'd gotten under the liberal constitution before. He fails in that regard, but he puts in an article that says that the place of women is in the home, serving their families rather than equal to men in public. He also is heavily influenced by Roman Catholic social thought in crafting the article about property, because lots of Roman Catholics at this time, in the crisis of capitalism, think they can find a new understanding of how the economy is going to work. And de Valera tries to incorporate that understanding in the Constitution. At the same time, he's the first person ever to elevate the idea of human dignity in a constitution. This is really the first one that says anything about human dignity. Now, I'm not claiming it's the highest idea. There's no first article like in the later West German Constitution 12 years later that says human dignity is inviolable, but it's remarkable that it's there. And in a way, de Valera, as part of this third way attempt to create a religious constitution, is also deserving credit for promoting this idea of human dignity. Now note, this can't have anything to do with World War II, obviously. It's not a response to the Holocaust either, way too early. And so maybe we're seeing a forgotten source of some of the ideas that are going to eventually follow World War II. Now, how did this happen? Well, my own little theory is that de Valera, who also owned and read the newspaper in Ireland, read it and read the text of one of the papal encyclicals that happened to be published in March 37, just as he was writing the Constitution. This encyclical came from Pius XII's predecessor, Pius XI, and though not as well noticed as the Christmas message in 1942, it really took a huge step towards canonizing the idea of human dignity. I don't think any pope had made it as central as Pius XI, even if Pius XII took a huge step beyond him. Now, actually, you may know this, Pius XI issued two encyclicals at the same time in March 1937. One was a denunciation of the Nazi regime for trampling on church rights that Vatican diplomats had negotiated with Hitler's regime. That encyclical is called Mit brennender Sorge. And again, it's not about the Jews. It's about church rights that were in violation of treaty. But he also issued the same day as the encyclical about Germany this encyclical about communism called Divini Redemptoris. And it's the one in which you see, like no Catholic, high-profile Catholic statement before, this centrality of human dignity. Now, it doesn't much matter if this is true, but I think it's the case that we can align the timeline on which de Valera is writing his constitution and the appearance of this encyclical and show pretty clearly that there's good circumstantial evidence that but for the encyclical, he might not have written dignity into the Constitution. Maybe you think it's accidental, but maybe there was something broader going on, which is that in 1937, Pius XI was having doubts about at least some aspects of the far-right choices that his flock was making in Europe. Definitely having doubts about far-left choices, communism especially. But maybe the Nazi case was also showing that at least secular fascism was not going to be a good choice, even as a lesser evil for believing Christians. After all, the Nazis trampled church rights and the Pope protested. And so in a way, you could argue that all Catholics are in a moment, maybe all Christians, of figuring out how to square what they believe God means for them, which is some kind of moral code, with the political choices available. And de Valera is saying there's a third way. We don't have to give up on liberal democracy, even though so many people think it's dreadful for religion because it's relativistic and creates a society of license. Maybe we can fix liberal democracy. Maybe we can save it from its own worst tendencies and create religious democracy, Christian democracy, precisely. And maybe what dignity meant is kind of that this experiment was starting. Well, as the clock continues into the later 30s and into World War II, the idea of human dignity becomes huge amongst Roman Catholics, especially when they're interpreting what the war is about. Pius XI uses it several more times before he passes away. And you see that this great American Jesuit also says the war is about the defense by Christians of human dignity against those who despise it, the axis. Now, this is an interesting example because I've interpreted what de Valera was doing and maybe what Pius XI was doing as, let's say, correcting a potential mistake that religious people might make, going too far right, making unholy alliances with too powerful of a state by creating a middle option, religious democracy. Now, interestingly, 5 years before the West German Constitution, Philippe Pétain, who was the authoritarian dictator of France during World War II, also wrote a constitution. This one wasn't approved because the Nazis who controlled Pétain wouldn't let him put it out. And yet he wrote it with the first article consecrating and protecting human dignity. Now, this does happen during World War II. It's not about the Jews because we know that Pétain has shipped off a third of French Jews to death. What I think is happening is he's like doing the opposite of what de Valera does. In the first few years of his rule, Pétain has tried to follow Portugal and create an integral Roman Catholic society. But now in 1944, he knows that the Americans are going to win the war. And so he says, I'm going to republicanize my regime. Now, maybe for good reasons, but also because he wants to see whether he can survive American victory and remain in power. Doesn't work out for him. But what he's doing, if you like, is taking an authoritarian Catholic regime and moving it left, trying to make it more centrist. If you like, meeting de Valera from the opposite direction. De Valera had moved from liberal democracy right. This guy, in the name of human dignity, is moving from authoritarianism left. We have these new tools which you can use called engrams, because, few read books, but Google has scanned all of them. And what that allows us to do is test when are people using words, phrases, and names. And here we have graphic evidence that in France, this crucial formula, dignité de la personne humaine, is on the rise in the 30s at this crisis time. This is an amazing one because you see it's delayed in the 30s, and as of 38, as the war approaches, suddenly that phrase gets used more and more. A good example of this is the leading Roman Catholic public thinker of this era named Jacques Melita, who has come to the United States in part because his wife, though also like him a convert to Roman Catholicism, was unlike him born Jewish, racially Jewish, according to National Socialist doctrine. And so they fled to avoid persecution. And he becomes a big fan of the United States. And he's one of the many who begins to say World War II is about human dignity. But notice, he says, don't worry. This claim that humans as such have high status, that they have rights that flow from it, doesn't mean that we're committing to license and relativism, that we're embracing the legacy of the French Revolution and modern philosophy. We found a new take, and we can embrace human dignity as part of a religious democracy. And in fact, he thinks that in this country, once he's seen enough of it, that he's found that kind of society. Well, 2 years later, after his original Christmas address, Pius XII gives another one. Here he says, I'm a Democrat. Hadn't said that before. And he says, we have to save democracy for religion. Embrace democracy now that the Americans are going to win the war, but make sure you do it in the way that de Valera has imagined, rather than in the direction of secularism and relativism. And the way you will do that is by starting with the idea of human dignity. It's actually quite a fascinating text if you look back at it. You can Google this too. Now, in the end, he defines democracy in a way that means conformity to Catholic natural law, such that you could even have a king and still count as a democracy. That's not the way most of us would use that term, democracy. And yet it's still significant at the moment of the victory of the Allies and of liberal democracy as you and I would define it, that Pius XII embraces it and says the key, though, is that you use human dignity to keep it in its proper boundaries and above all subservient to the most important thing, which is God's religious morality. Now then there's this mystery. How did it get into the Universal Declaration, which is not written by Roman Catholics alone? The answer is that already the concept of human dignity appears in the United Nations Charter, written in summer 1945. And these are photos taken by my iPhone of the woman who decided to put human dignity into the UN Charter. She got a draft of the preamble of that document from a South African statesman, and you can see, maybe this is a better one, that she crossed out what he had written, which said that humans are sanctified, and put in dignity instead. Now again, we're dealing with a total accident maybe. Just like de Valera, if he'd written his constitution 2 weeks before or a year later, might not have canonized dignity. Maybe we could live in a world in which the UN Charter said sanctity of the human personality rather than dignity. But she crossed it out and put in dignity. Now, I don't have the first clue why. I mean, I can't ask her. And I didn't find anything else in her archives about why she did this. My hypothesis is that the Pope has made it so current in transatlantic discourse that this Protestant could think this is what World War II was about. But I don't know. Clearly, it happened. Now, it's also, in fairness, I've made this argument for years, and so someone said, maybe you're overdoing it. His name is Charles Beitz. He's at Princeton University, and he said, the fact that no one raised a fuss about what Virginia Gildersleeve, who was the dean of Barnard College, did when she crossed out sanctity and put in dignity, already shows that dignity didn't mean very much, or it meant all things to all people. And maybe Chuck is right about that. But there's a big limitation to his argument, which is that when we look in Europe, we find this tight correlation between de Valera's idea and de Valera's kind of politics, namely religious democracy, Christian democracy. So the first example of that, actually, again, 3 years before the West German example, comes from the state in West Germany of Bavaria. And this man, whose name was Alois Hundhammer, a Roman Catholic conservative, wrote the preamble of the Bavarian Constitution, which still exists in that state, which starts with the idea, now in response to World War II, if not the Holocaust, that when we build a religious Christian state, we have to start with human dignity. Same thing happens in Italy in 1946 and 7. So that, I think, is the context, if not for the Universal Declaration and its version of dignity, since lots of countries were in the room on that one, 50 odd, for the European story, when only Christian Democrats who seem to understand that dignity is a signal for this new kind of democracy use the term. That's probably what the term meant in 1949 in West Germany, when Angela Merkel's party, the Christian Democrats, begin their 50-year rule of the country under this constitution that starts out with God and establishes a rather morally conservative regime and society for a long time under Christian democratic rule. Now, it's only fair to note that in Bavaria and in the Federal Republic, these folks don't care about the Holocaust. They don't know about it unless they've been involved in perpetrating it, but they do really care about the mistakes of World War II. They don't want the state to be as powerful as Adolf Hitler made it, because so many Christians suffered, including Hoon, who was thrown into Dachau as a Christian resistor. And so they have their own very good reasons from World War II to declare that there are these limits to state power in the name of individual dignity and rights. But they're also religious conservatives, and they care about how the country is going to be ruled. Like Pius XII, they care most about avoiding too secular a democracy, one where religion and moral rules are abandoned. So you see where I'm going, that the original meaning of human dignity, for better or worse, is connected to this new thing, religious democracy, Christian democracy. Now, maybe America in these years of the 40s and 50s was also a Christian democracy, though it didn't have a party that called itself that, unlike so many West European countries. Actually, Christianity has its last golden age in the global north in these years, including in this country. It's when we do things like add God to the Pledge of Allegiance in the face of the Soviet enemy, and when people like my fellow Missourian, Harry Truman, say it's critical that we defend human dignity against its opponents, namely the Soviets. Well, what's the meaning, in conclusion, that we take from this story? So I've just changed my mind about this living in this country in the past few years. So I'm going to tell you my old conclusions and my new ones to let you pick or come up with your own, because the fact that we can change our mind is the most important thing. So my old conclusion was that we should read this as a tragedy, because it's about how constitutional texts and indeed human rights could be co-opted by religious conservatives. Now, if you're a religious conservative, that's a good thing, and I just don't happen to be one. And so when I hear this story, I say, well, why can't we just have constitutionalism that's secular and, you know, more progressive politics? And so if those are your views, then you conclude from this story that the canonization of human dignity was as much about conservatives changing liberalism and human rights as it was about liberals putting limits on conservatives so they don't choose the far right. So that's one possible set of morals you might take from this story. And if that's true, it doesn't mean that dignity plays the same functions today. It's a claim about what it meant between the 1930s and the 1940s when it ascended to this crucial place in world politics. Actually, nowadays, I think Charles Beitz is right about the way dignity itself is used. Today, it's used in almost every constitution that's written, religious or not religious. A good example is the South African Constitution, which has been widely celebrated for starting also 50 years later with the idea of human dignity. More generally, a lot of people in the universities are now disciples of Immanuel Kant and have discovered that Kant also talked about dignity. But what they mean is usually secular liberalism, like all of the philosophers at Harvard are Kantians. And they believe in dignity, but they definitely don't associate it with religious conservatism. So if that's true, you might draw the lesson that we can, take dignity beyond this moment of origin that I'm trying to portray. The most important thing is that human rights, which are made friendly for Christianity in the 1930s and 40s, have had their own revolution. So however much they were talked about in the age of the popes and the Universal Declaration, something happened much later in the middle of the 1970s that, like human dignity, allow people to pursue lots of different projects in the name of human rights, very few of them religious conservative projects. Still, I worried when I first reconstructed this story that we might, have to remember that dignity's origins were about this pioneering political project called Christian democracy. Now there's a new set of conclusions that I've reached, and consider these two. What if we're in a situation like the 1930s? Not just that Christians are in that situation, in this and other countries, but people in general are. That sometimes we do have to choose between different kinds of conservatism that are on offer out there. And the question is, which should we prefer? If you're a Christian, should you choose something unholy, or should you guard against the kinds of mistakes that were made in the 1930s? Now, I won't talk about any particular country, but consider that the religious right in this country, including the majority of Roman Catholics, voted for Donald Trump. In France, there's a secular far right, actually, the heirs of Pétain, called the National Front. And it places a burden on the religious to decide who they will back. And there have been some candidates who say that they ought to, that French Catholics ought not to choose the National Front, but a religious conservatism that's more compatible with a liberal democracy. So those were the ideas of François Fillon in the last French presidential elections. Finally, think of Germany today, where there's a rising neo-fascist party called Alternative for Germany, Alternative für Deutschland. And when she talks about human dignity, Angela Merkel has been saying, don't choose the secular right, choose religious conservatism, which has consented to work within liberal democracy because it believes in human dignity. Indeed, that was her message to this country, to Donald Trump when we elected him. So maybe the lesson is that we should see this option that de Valera invented, and that Angela Merkel's party, she remembered, represents today as the best option we have, especially if you think that the far right can make terrible mistakes when it's in power. So that's another lesson. Which set of lessons you decide to take sort of depends on your politics and whether you have something even better to choose than the far right versus the Christian democratic right. For example, there's a Democratic Party in this country, and it's at war about what its party is going to offer in 2020. Thank you very much. Just to make it hard for myself, one could hear you saying, Sam, it can't be that this Irishman invented Christian democracy, but because Christians invented liberal democracy, not least in this country. And that there's a lot of truth to that. And of course, the idea of rights, even if dignity isn't named, has played a big role in this country long before the period I was talking about. And so, in a sense, there's more of a tradition than I let on. So I would say a few things in relation to that. It took some events for enough people to notice. For one thing, liberalism and especially constitutionalism, because of the French Revolution, got associated with a very different path, which was much more irreligious. In the 19th century, let's call him Maritain's predecessor, Alexis de Tocqueville, came to the United States, and he sends back a memo to France called Democracy in America that says, not only have these people invented something amazing, Christian democracy, but it's actually like excellent when you disestablish the church, as many European Protestants were still unwilling to do. And he said Roman Catholicism thrives, not just Protestantism, in a situation where Roman Catholics are in the minority. But even if that's true, Tocqueville was ignored in Europe. Consider that, for one thing, the standard Roman Catholic position, Leo XIII and first encyclical to the Americans, was that you all have this nice experiment when you're in the minority, a hypothetical experiment, but the Roman Catholic thesis is that where Roman Catholics are in the majority, they should not accept disestablished church, and they should want much more religious dominance in society, and not even democracy. Protestants in Europe, because of the Great Depression and because of their persecution by the secular state, go big for authoritarianism. Actually, Protestants are much likelier to be Nazis in Germany than Roman Catholics. But some big stuff happens for Protestantism too. Like all of the ancestral lands of Protestantism are lost in World War II to the east and become communist states. And they also have a kind of, difficult time where they learn that the American model might satisfy them too. So the suggestion is that you're totally right. No, it's a reflection. But so it seems like dignity gets associated, since it's not used by Americans, with the American experiment. And it allows a lot more Europeans and European Christians to consider whether it's right. Now, we should say that there's still a debate about whether it was the right choice. A lot of conservative Christians would now say, well, look what happened to Christianity in Europe. It died. At a minimum, it collapsed under liberal democratic auspices. It may have looked like a good solution for a while to try out this religious democracy, but democracy did better than religion in the end. And so there's an open debate about this. But I think you're surely right that this moment is just one. I think it happens to be the one that you have to look at if you're interested in dignity, that word and concept. I think it's just a fact that we can't find many people in the 40s, even the late 40s, who say they're principally concerned about what had happened to the Jews, mainly because so many people have suffered so many different things. I mean, there are famous atrocities after World War II, but there are atrocities like Lidice or, Oradour-sur-Glane, where Czechs and Christians suffered Nazi atrocity. But certainly that very fact suggests that after World War II, unlike before, people say we can't let the state get too powerful because of what happens when it does. And I totally agree with you. I would try to dislodge the fact that they're doing it because they cared about the Jews, just because that's so often said, and there's not enough evidence to support it. But my suggestion is they didn't just care about what happens when the state gets bad, but what their societies should be like. Because the socialists, the other party in Europe, also hated the Nazis, but they didn't win the elections. The Christian Democrats did. And they're the ones who are writing these constitutions and saying human dignity is so important. And I agree, it's totally about ruling out the extremes, but for the sake of religious conservatism. Yeah, so I didn't actually show a long-term engram of human dignity, and it doesn't have this same rise. And so I'm very interested, though, in what happened in the middle of the 1970s, because if you imagine the curve that the Universal Declaration affects, gives a little bump, and imagine it keeps going. Well, there are going to be a few people today who are talking about human rights, but not that many. And so what we really have to explain, if we're interested in the fate of human rights in our time, is not anything that went on in the 40s, which may be largely a Christian story, not completely, but very largely. I don't think this was a Christian story, actually, so that's why I didn't talk about it. It's partly a Christian story because the people who are involved in making human rights famous in the 70s consists, let's say, of three groups in which Christians are involved. One is Latin Americans who are under a new wave of autocracy, especially in the Southern Cone, and Catholics join with some kind of socialists, and they say, let's at least agree to press human rights against these dictatorships. In Eastern Europe, there are dissidents against communism, and again, the socialists who'd once dreamed of like a new kind of Marxism or a better form of socialism with a human face, say, maybe we should just ask for human rights. And that they find that idea in part in Roman Catholic discourse, and they make an alliance in places like Poland, mainly Catholic, with Christians to kind of press these minimal demands. And then you have Jimmy Carter, who's president at this moment, and he's a born-again Protestant, evangelical Protestant, and he says, I need to have a Christian or more moral foreign policy, and it's going to be based on human rights. And so there's, let's say, an input of Christianity in this moment, but I wouldn't say it's dominant. What's really important is that the left at this time kind of embraces the idea. Back in the 40s, it was kind of owned and operated by Christian Democrats standing down in Europe, socialists, because we haven't had socialists in this country until Bernie Sanders. At this time, socialists say, well, maybe we can't build utopia. Maybe communism failed. And especially since we're facing down a totalitarian state, maybe we ought to join Christians without, promoting religious morality, but at least asking for our basic human rights and a limit to state power. So that's what I think went on here, which is to say it's much less Christian a story than one about how the left changed. So my story about the 40s, to sum up, is it's about how the right changed. And my story about the 70s is it's about how the left changed. And only together can these stories explain how we're surfing up here now. My own view is that in the 1930s, Christians chose secular nationalism when they couldn't have their own. In places like Italy and Germany, when they could have their own, they preferred it. Places like Austria and Portugal and Spain and Ireland in a different way, and during the war, France and Slovakia, even though they were kind of puppet states, they still had much more, Catholicism in the mix than in Hitler's Germany. So I think like what you choose always depends on what the menu is. Now in this country, we know that especially evangelical Protestants who were, kind of supported Trump at the highest levels of most other groups, and Roman Catholics who support him at pretty high levels, didn't support him at first. They had put their money on other horses in the Republican race, but then it was Trump or Hillary. And so just as in the 30s, there was a choice to be made, a moral choice and a political choice, and we see what happens. There's not a unanimous choice of these groups, although evangelical Protestants are really high levels of choice. Now, it also depends whether they get what they want. Evangelical Protestants and many Roman Catholics we know are very happy because they've gotten so many conservative judges out of Trump. Even though Trump is the furthest thing from a Christian, as far as I can tell, you might get, abortion overturned on the Supreme Court of this country because of his appointments. And when you look at the lower levels of the federal judiciary, it's like a dream come true for many religious conservatives. So, a lot depends. Is there going to be a Republican challenger to Trump? We don't know. Are they pretty happy with what they've gotten? Seems like it. In these other countries, same analysis. We just have to kind of figure out, are there other choices? Now in Germany, Christian democracy has remained strong enough that it's a viable choice and a viable alternative to secular nationalism. But that could change. Same in France. So I think it depends mostly on the menu. The truth is if you have most power if you get to write the menu, because then people always choose what you predict once they have the menu. So to make a long story short, I think there's no simple answer. It depends on, how the choices are set up for voters in these various places who have like moral concerns and often religiously motivated ones. And then we can predict what they'll do once we know the choices. Are our concepts and talk kind of, do they help make us who we are? Or are they just kind of reflections of the real options out there and the balance of forces? So I think it's a little of both. In the 1930s and 40s, which I was mainly talking about, I tried to illustrate that concepts and talk changed. And it changed because it kind of reflected some real choices that initially just a few, like de Valera and Maritain, and then a lot of people after World War II were making. The choice to embrace democracy on condition that it remained compatible with religion and conservatism. But maybe you get caught up by your concepts and language. And then, years later, when someone says, accept a few refugees because you say you care about human dignity, even if, this is a totally new problem. No one in the 19th and 30s and 40s was talking about accepting Muslim migrants. And yet, in our new situation, this idea that we've kind of put in our constitutions and set as the foundation of our parties has some purchase that might not follow our interests or reflect exactly, reality. It has its own power. So my answer is like a little of both, which is why it's a great question.
Leave things with a great question. I know
Okay.
some of us will be able to join you for dinner and ask some more questions. So
Great. Thanks a
thank you
lot.
very, very much.
Sure.